Well, hey everyone, and welcome to the Real Life Practice podcast. My name is Lindsay Sturkey, and I'm so excited that you are joining us today. We are continuing a series we have been doing about seasons of formation. And so we've been having conversations with people in different seasons and stages of life and talking about how our faith grows and develops through the years. And so we have loved learning from people in all stages of life. And no matter where you find yourself, we know that we can learn from those who are maybe a few steps ahead of us, or maybe those who are coming behind us. We can learn from each other's stories. And so today, I'm so excited to welcome a special guest with us today. Lori Shoults is joining us for a conversation. So, Lori, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Lindsay. I'm glad to be here.
Well, Lori, just to start out, would you just kind of introduce yourself to our listeners, share a little bit about who you are, your family, the work that you do? Just introduce yourself so we can get to know you a little bit.
Sure. So I'm in my late 50s, just to give you a sense of my season of life, 58. And I have, at this point in my life, I have three kids. Two of them are married, and I have two grandchildren at the moment, two little granddaughters, a 4-year old and a 8-week old little granddaughter. And then I have another one on the way. My daughter-in-law is expecting a baby in August. And so I'm in a really sweet season of life, grown kids, lots of independence there. And we're far into our empty nesting years, but not yet retired. Ministry wise, I've been really involved in the last 15 years or so in lots of contemplative ministry, from the practice at Willow Creek, which was a ministry I was a part of years ago. That was a contemplative liturgical service at Willow Creek Church. And then also have done a lot of work in the area of spiritual formation. I helped oversee a program at Moody Bible Institute for a period of 3 years. That was a spiritual formation certificate program, cohort style. Also in that time frame, was trained as a spiritual director, although it took me about a 10-year journey to actually become a trained, 2-year program director through Sustainable Faith. And so I did my first year with Sybil Towner back in like 2012, I think, and then just completed that a couple years ago. And so trained spiritual director. A lot of my work has really been centered around, in these last number of years, the Ignatian Exercises. And so I sort of have a before in like my life before and after the Ignatian Exercises a bit in my spiritual journey also. I grew up in the church. My dad was a pastor. And so I really don't remember a time not being connected to the church or my relationship with Jesus. But that has changed dramatically, over the years. So my background, it was in the Salvation Army. And so that I really am so, so grateful, and am growing even greater appreciation as I, get older, for my upbringing and the good foundation that was there. God did a lot of, I guess I have sort of a conversion story that, outside of, growing up in it, when I was in my early 40s, I encountered somebody who was a spiritual director and also a counselor. And God just set me sort of on a new path. It was a bit disorienting. And so I have that was, about a year-long journey of formation, that I can share more about. But yeah, that's sort of where I am in life right now. Oh, and I also spend a lot of time working with a thing called Pastors, Priests, and Guides retreats. And so that's another part of the ministry that I feel deeply connected to, where we offer retreats. We're in the process of building more of we'd like to call it a formation ecosystem to support pastors, priests, and we say guides, meaning really anybody who's in any kind of ministry and leadership. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Lori. I love hearing, and we'll share more at the end too, how people can connect with the work you're doing now. But I know we got connected originally through Sybil Towner, who is one of the founding leaders of One Life Maps, a tool that we use here at the process now. And so Lori has been helping us. She's helped us facilitate some of our calls in the past, and has just, I just love getting to see the work that you're doing. And there's a lot of overlap, I feel like, between the work that you feel called to do and the work that we're doing here. And so it's just been a gift to just partner at times and kind of cheer each other on. And so I'm excited just to hear, just continuing what that work looks like for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more. You started to tell us some about your upbringing and your faith journey, but if you had to kind of lay out what that looked like for you from your growing up years, and then you mentioned kind of in your 40s there was a turning point. Like, can you share a little bit more about just your overall faith journey and what that looked like for you?
Yeah. So, I mean, if I looked at the first 40 some years of my life, I would say that my faith journey was very faithful and very traditional. I feel like I had a really traditional upbringing, really good foundation in knowing a lot about God. And then I started in like leadership in the church when I was pretty young and just served in many ways. Didn't I think I had a sense that I didn't necessarily feel I don't know, deeply spiritual. I want to say there wasn't a lot of there wasn't my relationship with Jesus wasn't very dynamic. It was very knowledge based, and I didn't know a whole lot about myself back then, which is part of the change of what occurred when I kind of went through this new spiritual journey. But I would say I knew a lot about God, and there was very little emotional connection to it, if that makes sense. I didn't know that. I mean, I feel like there was a lot of feel like it was marked with I think a lot of joy. And also, if I had to say, how did I kind of find my way in my spiritual life? I could say it was finding a way to be content in all circumstances. What I later discovered is when I did some work with the Enneagram, I discovered that I identify as a 7 on the Enneagram. And so there was just a lot of disconnect for me emotionally. I was very much in my head. So when I encountered this person we were actually working together with a family at the time when I encountered this person who was a counselor and spiritual director. And we ended up having coffee together ourselves. And we were basically there to support another person, but she didn't come that particular day. And so I was very unsuspecting. And this spiritual director when I had never heard of spiritual formation or spiritual direction or any of those kinds of things. And she just asked me the question. She said, "It feels like you're pretty okay all the time. I'm kind of curious where that strength comes from and where that leads you with the Lord." And my first thought was, no one's ever asked me a question like that before. And
Mm.
so it doesn't sound very profound, other than the fact that as I tried to answer, I felt like nothing felt really honest or true. I wanted to say, well, my strength comes from the Lord. And then I thought that doesn't really feel, if that's true, I don't really couldn't say how.
Mm.
And so it was just, I think she was recognizing probably a lack of vulnerability
Mm.
in me in some of the work we had been doing together. And so then I thought, is that a bad thing to have strength? So that
Mm.
was again, no one's ever questioned that in me. Uh,
Yeah.
and that so I spent the next couple of weeks reflecting on that. We ended up meeting again. And again, this other person wasn't there. And so we ended up in conversation and I started sharing some of my response to that. And within about 5 minutes, she said, "How are you feeling while you're sharing this with me?" And I had to even think about what I had just said. And I ended up saying, "Do I look like I'm feeling something?" Because I wasn't crying. And so it wasn't
Yeah.
something that I was really, very aware of. And so I had to think that to myself, what I just shared sounded a little bit, I said, I think it sounds kind of sad,
Mm.
but it wasn't at all connected to that. And so then I continued sharing, and then the tears just started pouring
Mm.
out. And I basically spent about 3 hours crying that day. And I couldn't have told you where those were coming from, but that had never happened to me before. And so it just was the beginning of opening up something inside of me. And really, so much of it, as I look back, if I could summarize it, would say that I was beginning to learn more about myself. And so I
Mm.
knew a lot about God, a lot of head knowledge, and I knew very little about myself as far as in any kind of inward journey. And so there was a lot that was blocking me from having any kind of deep, intimate relationship with Jesus. And I just didn't know. And
Mm.
so I spent about a year going through, and it really authors became my teachers that year. I mean, I didn't really have other people in my community that, knew or could really understand what I was experiencing or support it. And so one book led to the next, to the next. I mean, I went from someone had recommended that I read Sacred Rhythms by Ruth Haley Barton. And I went right from, I over in a 6-month time period, I went from reading Ruth Haley Barton to Teresa of Avila. So all of a sudden I was reading the Christian mystics. I mean, I had no idea how I had gotten there. But at the end of about a year, God had taken me on this very dynamic journey. And thankfully, I had journaled my way through that. And it was hard. At the beginning, I thought, I'm not sure if I'll ever stop crying. I found myself in a place of really what was happening is I was encountering God's love for me in a way I never had before. And it was actually it was sending me to my knees. I found myself in a place of deep repentance, but not in a way that felt shaming or actually felt like joyful and like freedom. And so there was a period of time where I just was finding myself in a lot of confession. And a lot of it was discovering through scripture, like I really connected to the story of Peter in that time. And I found myself really connecting to Peter's strength and the sense where he was like so confident in himself, even if all of these other people would fall away, would never deny you. And then he did. And I felt so clearly how it wasn't until Peter recognized his own capacity for sin, that Jesus could then do something with him, And so I feel like that's what I sensed in that time period where a lot of my confession was in my own self-sufficiency and my own, all these survival mechanisms I had put in place and defenses. I discovered things like David Benner saying, you can't receive love in a defended place, a defended state. And I thought, that's all I am. I just receiving love. I just didn't have the vulnerability. I kept myself in a really sort of safe place. And that really impacted not only my relationship with Jesus, but I was learning that was true in my marriage too, So there were lots of ways that I had maintained that kind of a posture. And so I got into my story, and part of that, some of my work with One Life Maps even was in that time period where I was like, why would I need to know my story? Well, this is what was naturally just coming forward was where in my story was that, where had I felt that before? And recognizing that a lot of this came from things that had been set up so long ago that it's not something I consciously remembered. And so I did a ton of story work in that time period. And that was, it was really learning how important it was in my relationship with Jesus to know more about him, but also more about myself and the back and forth between those two. So.
Thanks, Lori. I love how that one powerful question from the person you were meeting with kind of led you into that space of recognizing a piece that was missing in your walk with God and connecting with the vulnerability and not only knowing God, but knowing yourself. That's such a beautiful shift in your journey, it sounds like. And I'm curious if, I know you said that was in your 40s. Is that right that happened?
Yeah.
When you think back to that particular season of life, is there anything about that particular, like why then? Why do you think that was the time that came up? Do you think it connected to your season of life, or was it just kind of the timing of that conversation?
I think it did in the sense that, I couldn't tell you for sure other than just the fact that, we think about that, like that first half of life, you're sort of building up your life. And then there's something that goes on with that second half. When I think about the stages of faith now, that what I know now, things like the critical journey, where I was in my own life, I feel like so far my spiritual journey, those early stages of faith had carried me just fine. I was content. I had no idea that there was something more. It wasn't one of those people that was like, it just feels like something's missing. I wasn't actually longing for something more. And so I think it took that kind of, poking around at me. No one had really done that much or at all that I can recall. Or maybe they had tried and I had missed it. That could be too. But at this point in my life, I just must have had a readiness and an openness. And also, when you go through things in your marriage, I think that marriage is such a place of where we're being always formed. And I think in the moments, like in my most honest moments, in that moment of questioning, the things that were coming up for me were places where I thought, I wonder if this is what's coming up for me in my marriage. And so when I started to recognize some of my own defensiveness, my own protection, places and those kinds of things, and I think it started to just feel true. I'm not sure it would have felt true to me in my 30s. I was still just in a different place of just, I don't know, sort of moving through life and I don't want to say achieving so much, but more just doing life and leadership and, what I imagined was like the way to do the Christian life as well. So yeah, I hadn't run out of that hadn't run out for me. And honestly, Lindsay, I could have gone my whole life. And I think this is
Mhm.
one of the things that I think is common in the church is that those early stages of faith are really all that get kind of that's the arc, that's in the church and you serve and then there's not really a pathway beyond that for that inward journey part. And so what is it that's going to get you to see that there's so much more?
Right.
So yeah, so
Yeah.
I think there just was a readiness second half of life, wasn't having a crisis of faith or um, even life,
Yeah.
but I must have had an openness and readiness for
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. And I love how you're able to notice how that did connect with your marriage and other
Yeah.
parts of your life. And that, when we're invited to kind of move forward and take another step, that we bring our whole life with us. It's not our
Yeah.
spiritual life is not this isolated thing with God, but it impacts our family, our community, our work, our ministry. All of that is touched by it, which I think is such a beautiful thing. And God uses all of those to open us up to what He has.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to even be necessarily negative things. It wasn't like there were major, like huge negative patterns or, things that needed to be broken. But I mean, again, now I know we're all addicted to something, so
Yeah.
it's just I just didn't even think about that or know my own sin,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious, Lori, now of when you think about your current life stage and your current season of life, how that has either continued to unfold for you, how
Mm.
it's shifted, when you think about your current life stage and your current place with God, what have you noticed about what is unique about that right now for you and how that
Mhm.
feels?
Yeah, and this is why I kind of feel like I have to say, like, there's like a before and after the Ignatian exercises for me. So, because I feel like
Yeah.
everything now, as I explain or think about my spiritual journey, kind of runs through a bit of that lens. And what I discovered in the midst of, after that year-long journey that I mentioned, was when I first heard about the Ignatian exercises. And I didn't even know anything about them or dive deep into them. I just saw the flow of the exercises, which is sort of like a six-part thing, and or actually 5 parts. It starts with these preparation days where you're understanding God, God's unconditional love, and then it moves towards our limited response to that, which is really kind of getting into your sin patterns, and then the light journey through the life of Christ, and then the journey to the cross, and then the resurrection life. And when I saw those movements, there's something just stirred at me. Like I just knew I've been on this journey. This is the journey that God just led me on very organically. It didn't have a path, but I went back in my journal and I could mark exactly where those movements occurred in that year-long journey. And so I encountered God's love for me in a new way. It led me into an encounter with myself. It just so naturally. And then I found myself reading, like getting into the gospel stories and getting to know Jesus and encountering Jesus in a new way, not just hearing about and learning more about, but really encountering him. And then naturally that led to the like being with him in his suffering and death. And then the resurrection life. Like it was like that, all this inward, and then all of a sudden, now how am I to live?
Yeah.
And so those movements just felt like this path for spiritual growth that just all of a sudden felt so dynamic to me. And it's just a path I, continue to sort of live out of. And in the midst of that, a lot of what I was discovering was that it's actually a path of learning how to die.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
this was not good news for a 7, because I was like moving through life trying to kind of stay sort of head above the water, always moving towards the light, that kind of thing. And recognizing that, oh no, this is actually a spiral journey, not necessarily downward, but to greater reality.
Yeah.
But always in the context of God's unconditional love. So learning that I was a beloved sinner, and really connecting to what that meant. And so I would say these days, my journey is marked with, gosh, I almost can't talk about this without talking about the Paschal mystery. My journey is marked by the Paschal mystery with this ongoing cycle, whether it's moment by moment, daily, big deaths and small deaths, learning this posture of dying to self and opening up to what God has for me and receiving that. And a lot of that is going back to that vulnerability of learning how to receive the things that you would never have chosen.
Mm.
So when I say the Paschal mystery, that comes from, well, my understanding, comes from Ron Rolheiser's book, The Holy Longing. And when I first saw that, that's another kind of like the Ignatian Exercises. Like, I never understood this path. I've always thought about Good Friday and Easter Sunday, death and resurrection. And resurrection brings, joy. But really, he describes that the death Good Friday is really just a dying, but then you basically wake up that next moment in resurrection, the new life. But you don't yet know what this is going to mean for you. So it's new. It might not actually feel joyful. And so then there's these other parts to it which follow the church year calendar, which it's beautiful. The 40 days after the resurrection, where Jesus is appearing to the disciples, and he calls it a time for readjustment, those 40 days. And it's grieving what's been lost to make room for what God's doing that's new. And so it's this time for adjustment. And then the ascension is the letting go. So that's like after that 40 days. And then Pentecost is the receiving the new spirit for this actual new life that you're in. And so that whole path, well, I just never would have known how to grieve, for one thing. I wouldn't have even recognized those losses. And so that it feels now like it has to pass through those stages, that there has to be some time, because always when something new is happening, it's like the disciples, it's wonderful that Jesus is alive and he's resurrected, but it may not be what we were expecting yet. And so not clinging. And so I'd say these days, my journey is moving toward an ongoing posture. Everything, all the spiritual practices that that have been sort of integrated into my life have to do with moving towards consent, moving towards consent and an open posture of receiving all that actually is coming to reality and accepting that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Lori, what are some examples of what that looks like in your life in this current season? That call to die, the practice of consent. Is there anything that comes to mind that you feel like is unique to your life season right now?
Yeah. Well, just this last October, I was actually diagnosed with breast cancer. And so that's a pretty tangible, if I ever had to live into a bit of what this journey looks like of consent, it was, that was a real new one. And it was one that, I've really taken my health for granted. And so I was shocked. It wasn't something I stepped into, kicking at my heels and, running towards. I had some real resistance when I first got that diagnosis, especially. And then it was scary. There's so much I had a crash course in breast cancer. And in my case, it had a really good outcome. And I'm grateful to say it was a big, a lot of change in my life, surgery and all of that. They thought it was going to be triple negative breast cancer. It turned out to be, every step of the way, it kept coming back surprisingly non-invasive. And so super grateful for the outcome. But as I engaged in that along the way, especially in those times, 2 weeks when I was waiting for an MRI to confirm if it was invasive or non-invasive, I really had to come face to face with my willingness to consent to whatever this journey was going to hold, even if it was to my death. And so that was probably as close as I've come to really facing that and, really wanting to live, having that desire. It's such a fun season of life with my family and my kids. Hard to imagine, letting go of that. And so, so I found myself going into that MRI and I felt so much consolation, which quite often that's where I recognize consolation is when it feels like it should be desolation. And I'm finding myself more in consolation. But that should have been full of anxiety for me. And as I wheeled into that MRI that day, I found myself kind of stumbling into a breath prayer that our good friend, Father Michael, quite often says when he's about to begin a practice. And I'm not sure he's ever used it quite this way. But I found myself just over and over just saying, breathe in God's light and love and strength and breathe out all that is not of God. And for 20 minutes, I just prayed that prayer and my heart rate never changed. Yeah. And so I found myself just in a place of receiving, regardless of what the outcome of this MRI was going to be. And I was so grateful for having had some practices put in place to be willing to consent, to just even know that that was part of, what I'd be even aiming towards.
Mm.
So, yeah, so that's one. And I think there's something about having come from a place of what I would have thought was joy, in the past where I had a real easy sort of pathway to joy, but it was really the illusion. It was sort of not going through the pain of things, if that makes
Mhm.
sense. So now I'm just much more aware of taking that full path of allowing something to really touch me, to feel it, to receive it, to welcome it. And, so as it comes through to a place of joy, it's more real. It's like, well, I would say with the 7 sober joy, sort of having passed through the whole cycle, not just, getting there in a way that doesn't pass through the real. So,
Sure. Wow. Thank you for sharing that just tender part of your
yeah.
story with us. And I know that everyone listening has those things that we would not have chosen.
Mhm.
And so, what a beautiful picture of what does it look like to consent within that and to discover God with us. And I love even the practical that you shared of that breath prayer of what it looked like to know God was with you and to invite his strength and his love. That's just such, I always love when there is a tangible practice that we can bring with us into times
Mhm.
like that. Not that we can manufacture something to happen or that there's a formula, but that there are ways for us to create space where we are open to God's love in just those most painful of moments and to
Mhm.
find him with you in that. Man, that's such a beautiful picture. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hmm. So when you think about what you know now and what you've experienced now, and you think about earlier decades, what do you feel like is just the biggest gift, the biggest surprise? Like, what are you noticing now about God that maybe you didn't know before that you're just able to name with us today?
Yeah. I I don't think I would have thought of myself as being an anxious person before in the past, which is funny because I feel like that's what really is kind of underneath everything of, trying to maintain a place of equilibrium or strength. It's trying to, stay from feeling that anxiety. But I feel like these days, I think there's something a big shift that I think has occurred is that I don't, there's less fear on the inside. If I have, and I have to say I wasn't fully aware of what was driving some of the things that I was doing. I think that's
Mhm.
probably typical for all of us as we discover, what's behind all of that. But I think there's less fear because there's more of a, when you're moving towards, which my friend Jonathan did a teaching about anticipatory versus participatory hope.
Mhm.
And I think there's something about clinging to something, an outcome, and a lot of my security was probably based on in the past, clinging to a particular outcome, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
What my expectations were of something, and so as I've learned to cling to an outcome, like so, for example, he taught out of the road to Emmaus, passage. And so these disciples had lost all hope because what they were hoping for had not happened. In fact, it had gone the opposite direction. And so now they're walking away. As Jesus opens up, something new to them, they turn and they're coming back, but they don't, again, kind of like with the Paschal mystery, they don't yet know what it's going to mean, you know? And so the, if you continue to cling to the expectation of what if they had thought, well, he's going to still overthrow the Roman government or whatever they thought, whatever their expectations were before that, if they continued to hold on to that, then he wouldn't have been able to reveal to them what he wanted to give them. That was more true. That was more real, even though they didn't have the imagination for it yet. And so I think now the one thing that helps with not having that fear or anxiety is not being so set on my expectations, if that makes
Mhm.
sense.
Is it?
Not clinging to what the outcome has to be in order for me to be okay. If
Yeah.
that, yeah. And so
Yeah.
there's something about these practices and this posture and understanding that I have of God's love for me, a deeper knowing of God's love for me, that the outcome is not as important, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's the not clinging. It's the, opening my hands and my posture, which you can almost imagine the practices that go along with that, right, Lindsay? It's like what's going on in my body. So I've done a lot of work with learning my emotions. And these days, especially going through this cancer journey, I feel like some of the invitation is getting in touch with my body. Where am I holding that? What's my posture like on it? I might say have an openness, but am I actually open? And so there's a lot of sort of body posture kind of work for me right now, just even in holding my hands open, to sort of reflect. Father Michael always says, say with your body what you're saying with your heart. And that hasn't been always true for me. There's been a real disconnect there. And so that's probably a more current invitation. It's, getting more in touch with my body, which I got a little bit forced into. So.
Yes. Yes. That's such a beautiful way of noticing God's formation in all of you. And like you said, with your health, of really paying attention to what your body was telling you in a way that you didn't have a choice, but you were open to not just, like you said, the outcome of like focusing on the outcome, but what is God forming in me through this? And can I release the
Right.
outcome and how that impacts your anxiety? Like that's a
Yeah.
lot. So I'm going to be thinking about that. I love the way
Well,
that you said that. And it's just powerful. So thank you.
so it's a lot
Yeah.
different than praying and holding on to a particular. So the difference with so the anticipatory hope is, clinging to that outcome, and then really more participatory hope. What does it look like to participate with hope, even without not knowing what the outcome's going to be? Can you still be moving in that direction?
Right.
And which I think is so tied to our depth of knowledge of God's love for us.
Yeah.
Like a real knowing, not just oh yes, I do know that, but more of a deep knowing.
So is there anything else you would share about just what your kind of rhythms with God look like in this current season? If there's any certain practices that are connecting with you, or just what does it look like to connect with God in your everyday life right now?
I think well, like I was saying, some of it is that some of the newer practices I think are more embodied kinds of practices that do involve even walking is one of the things that I've just been that actually occurred when I was going through my cancer journey. I just sort of like upped my, some of my physical activity in that way. And I found it to be really, a beautiful part of my spiritual practice, really. One of the other things that I've been doing lately is reading out loud with my husband, which is, it's kind of I wouldn't have normally thought of that as a spiritual practice, but we've worked our way through Pursuit of God by A.W. Tozer and most recently Mere Christianity. And I'm reminded as I do that reading out loud and sort of in community, there's something I just love engaging around something. And so one of the things that came up in the most recently in the Mere Christianity was talking about how we have to know our own bankruptcy. So sometimes some of those things that someone like C.S. Lewis just throws out there just cause me to wrestle, and so, and especially when I'm hearing it out loud and, talking about it right in that moment, to know our own bankruptcy. It's kind of like we have to know our own story. We have to know what happened to us. We have to know where these things are coming from. And so reading out loud has been a more recent spiritual practice. And then things like, along with the physical, I've incorporated fasting a little bit more. So for a little while especially during my cancer journey, that several months, I was fasting, 2 days a week. And when I say fast days a week, I did a couple of long ones, but mostly it was, more like until 2:00, the next day, like dinner to 2:00 the next day. And that's been really helpful as far as even noticing things in my body, just paying attention to things like hunger and what do I do with that? And so that's been rich. I've now just been doing it once a week, to stay regular with that. And it's just been a good practice for me. And then Sabbath has been, setting aside, Sundays are, really set apart for us here. We've been practicing that for, we started practicing that more consistently during COVID. And so that was a real gift of, COVID for us here. So it still feels, when I wake up on that Sunday morning, it just feels like a different kind of day,
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are some of the ones that come to mind right now.
Thank you. I always just love hearing the practicalities of what it looks like in people's life of, again, creating space to connect with God and be open to what he has. So thanks for sharing what that
Well,
looks
can I
like for
share
you
one
now.
more that I just thought of?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I almost can't. I feel like I want to say sort of like a combination of the examine and slash prayer of indifference. And there's something, I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with those, but prayer of examine is a little bit more common. I feel like prayer of examine has been a big practice that I've done sometimes more like on like purposefully, regularly, daily, the prayer of examine, where I'm really paying attention to things like my emotion that were coming up for the day. And also starting off with prayer of gratitude, sitting in God's love for me, those kinds of things. And having practiced that so much in these last, gosh, now a number of years, it's really become more integrated into my life, So whether even if I don't practice it formally like I was in the past, I just notice it's like I carry the examine throughout my day. I pay
Mhm.
closer attention to things like gratitude and the emotions that are coming up for me, especially negative ones that I might have just passed on by. So the examine's been a big and important one, continuing to be an important one. And then prayer of indifference just feels more like that open posture, more open to God's will. And so that's been that, again, more integrated,
Yeah.
not as much of a specific practice
Right.
daily, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love having both of those. If you have specific times of your day that you are intentionally stopping and
Mhm.
connecting with God, but then a prayer like that can kind of be woven into just throughout your day as you're
Right.
aware of God's presence with you and that posture that you're in with him throughout your day.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
Well, Lori, thanks so much for sharing your story with us and how
Yeah.
God's been moving. I always just love hearing the uniqueness of how God invites us in our stories as we look back, but then also as we look forward of how he's just been so present with you and the ways that you've been open to even in really tough circumstances, finding God in those and learning more, as you said, learning the information, but then moving to an experience of transformation of living it. You talk when talking about your cancer of how you had to live out that Paschal mystery and learn it through experience. So thanks for sharing that with us today.
Yeah. Thanks for
Yeah.
having me, Lindsay. This has been always a rich conversation.
Yes, absolutely. So I'd love for you to share, and we can put a link in the show notes. And if people want to learn more about you or the work that you do, what's the best way for people to connect with you?
Yeah, there's a couple ways. So the work that I do with the Ignatian Exercises is called the Ignatian Journey, and it's a 32-week journey through the Ignatian Exercises. I'm actually in the process of trying to put together also, and that's considered a 19th annotation, which if anyone knows anything about the exercises, is the longer retreat in everyday life. I'm also working on putting together an 18th annotation, which is more of a 10-week, go for people who aren't able to do the 32-week journey, a shorter version, more like a taste of the exercises. That's on the ignatianjourney.com. And you can find all kinds of information there about different ways that you can engage with the Ignatian exercises. And then also we have a website called the Practice Collective. It's practicecollective.org. And that has a directory of spiritual directors on it. And it's, some of the ministry that, I spend time with. And then also lots of resources. And so our hope with that Practice Collective is it's a way to help people find their next steps spiritually. So it's some
Mm.
things that we offer, but then it's also lots of other ministries and things that people can engage with as they're kind of searching for what's next. And then the last one is the Pastors, Priests, and Guides retreat. So pastorspriestsandguides.com. And we have several retreats this year, some 1 days and also a long one in November in Malibu, which is not a terrible place to go in November. And so we have those retreats are really for, if anyone's curious about them, it's probably for them. You don't have to be a pastor or a priest. It can just be, if it seems like a fit, then it's something that they should, look into and join us for. And then we have some other new opportunities starting to branch off of that. So yeah, so pastorspriestsandguides.com. So
Perfect. Well, we will put
yeah,
links to all of those in the show
great.
notes. Yeah. And like I said, I just love getting to see the work that you're doing and the way that you are equipping people to take their next steps in their own spiritual journey And I know we're going to get to collaborate more in the future. And I'm just excited about the work you're doing in the world and just getting to kind of witness that and point people in your direction as well. So we'll put that in the show notes for people to connect with you there. So thanks so
Great.
much,
Thanks so
Lori,
much.
again.
Yeah, thank
So
you.
glad to have you. Well, thanks for joining us, everyone. Make sure to check out the show notes to connect with Lori. We also have a couple resources in there for you. This season, we have the Life Development Questions resource, which is a great tool to use if you are kind of exploring in your own journey what God might be doing in your current life season and what He might be inviting you to next. There are some great questions for reflection in there. Lori also mentioned One Life Maps, which is our tool for recognizing and responding to God in your story. And so we have a personal digital download you can get for that. You can also do a subscription if you use that tool in your work with others. So check out the show notes for all those resources. This is such a fun season we've been doing. I love hearing the story of God at work in different life stages. And so I hope that you will join us for a new episode soon. Check out the show notes and we'll talk again soon. Thanks, everyone.